In 1932, Benito Mussolini was the most admired man in the world. Winston Churchill called him a Roman genius. Thomas Edison called him the greatest genius of the modern age. He didn't just lead a country, he invented a word that would change the world forever: fascism. He promised to turn Italy into a new Roman Empire, to make the Mediterranean an Italian lake, and to live forever as a god-king. But 13 years later, that god was found hiding in the back of a German truck, wearing a drunken soldier's coat, hoping no one would recognize his face. How did a socialist journalist become the world's first modern dictator? And how did his dream of a 1,000-year empire end in a dusty square in Milan, hanging by a meat hook? Today, we go inside the mind of Il Duce to witness the rise and the brutal, bloody fall of Mussolini's Italy. The history of Benito Mussolini is not a straight line. It is a circle that begins and ends in the piazza. To understand the man, you must first look at two images, 23 years apart. The first is the Palazzo Venezia in 1922. Mussolini stands on a balcony, a titan carved from stone, chin thrust forward, eyes wide and manic, commanding the adoration of a sea of black shirts. He is the Caesar of the 20th century, the man who promised to make the Mediterranean an Italian lake. The second image is Piazzale Loreto in 1945. The titan is gone. In his place is a corpse, beaten beyond recognition, hanging upside down by a meat hook from the roof of a Standard Oil gas station. The crowd that once screamed his name now spits on his face. Between the balcony and the meat hook lies the story of a man who didn't want to lead the people, he wanted to own them. The fire began in Dovia di Pradapio, a dusty hamlet in the Romagna region. Benito was born in 1883 to Alessandro, a blacksmith whose skin was permanently stained with soot and socialist fervor. Alessandro didn't name his son after a saint. He named him Benito Amilcar Andrea, after Benito Juarez, the Mexican revolutionary who executed an emperor. From the cradle, Mussolini was a creature of friction. He was a silent, brooding child with eyes like scorched coals. He didn't play with other children, he dominated them. When he was 10, a classmate crossed him. Benito didn't throw a punch, he drew a penknife and drove it into the boy's hand. Expelled, shipped off to a Silesian boarding school. There he learned the first rule of the world: hierarchy is everything. He stabbed another student at the boarding school a few years later. The pattern was set. He was a boy who felt the world was a locked door, and violence was the only key that fit the lock. By 1902, the rebellious child had become a radical drifter. To avoid military service, he fled to Switzerland with nothing but a medallion of Karl Marx in his pocket. This is the hunger phase of the future Duce. He lived the life of a professional agitator, sleeping under the stone bridges of Zurich and Geneva like a stray dog. He worked as a stonemason, but his hands were meant for lighter, more dangerous tools: the pen and the podium. In the cold Swiss libraries, he devoured the works of Friedrich Nietzsche and George Sorel. He didn't just read them, he weaponized them. From Nietzsche, he stole the Übermensch, the idea of a man who rises above slave morality to impose his will on the world. From Sorel, he learned the myth of violence, the belief that a society is only rejuvenated through a shattering blow of collective action. He was a socialist, yes, but of a different breed. He wasn't interested in the dry economics of Marx, he was interested in the psychology of the mob. He realized that the masses didn't want a policy, they wanted a religion. The Great War arrived in 1914, and it acted as a centrifuge, spinning Mussolini's soul until the socialism fell away, leaving only a hard, jagged core of nationalism. The internationalists wanted peace, Mussolini wanted the fire. He broke with the Socialist Party, founded his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, and began screaming for intervention. He realized that class was a weak bond, blood and soil were the true tethers. He entered the trenches of World War I as a corporal. It was here, amidst the mud of the Isonzo and the mustard gas of the Carso, that his blood baptism occurred. He saw men die not for a higher wage, but for a flag. He saw that the industrial scale of death had flattened the individual. The smell of gunpowder replaced the ink of the newspapers. In 1917, he was wounded when a mortar exploded in his trench, peppering his body with 40 shards of metal. As he lay in the hospital, he looked at Italy and saw a mutilated victory. The war had ended, but for Mussolini, the real battle was just beginning. He returned to Milan in 1919, no longer a journalist, but a wolf. The streets were chaotic, strikes, bread lines, and the looming shadow of the Bolshevik Revolution. Mussolini watched, he waited. He understood something his rivals didn't. Italy was a country of fatherless men looking for a patriarch. He began to gather the Arditi, the elite stormtroopers of the war, into a new movement. They wore black shirts, the color of funeral shrouds. He stopped writing about the proletariat and started talking about the nation. He didn't offer a platform, he offered a spectacle. He was the first modern politician to realize that emotion beats logic every time. He stood in the piazza, chest puffed, jaw set like a trap, and spoke in short, rhythmic bursts. He wasn't talking to their brains, he was talking to their spines. He was the man of the crowd, a mirror reflecting the people's darkest insecurities and their grandest delusions back at them. He had learned how to play the human instrument. Now he just needed a stage big enough to hold his ego. He turned his gaze toward Rome, and the shadows of the Blackshirts began to lengthen across the Italian sun. By 1922, Italy was a fever dream of smoke and shattered glass. The Red Biennium, 2 years of socialist strikes and factory occupations, had left the middle class paralyzed with a singular, icy fear that the ghost of Lenin was crossing the Alps. Mussolini, the master opportunist, smelled the rot. He didn't offer a policy to fix the economy, he offered a cudgel to break the strikers. He transformed his movement into the Squadrismo and paramilitary wing of Blackshirts who turned the Italian countryside into a laboratory of political violence. This was the theater of the street. These weren't disciplined legions, they were a collection of disgruntled veterans, bored youths, and professional thugs fueled by a toxic cocktail of nationalism and adrenaline. Their weapon of choice was the manganello, a heavy wooden club, and, more humiliatingly, castor oil. They would corner socialist mayors or union leaders, beat them senseless, and force-feed them massive doses of the laxative, literally purging their subversive ideas in a public display of degradation. The state watched, paralyzed. The police looked the other way. The Blackshirts were doing the dirty work the government was too polite to do themselves. Mussolini realized then that if you control the streets, the law will eventually bow to you. In October 1922, Mussolini decided to go for the throat. He called for the March on Rome. From the podium, he was a lion. Either the government will be given to us, or we shall seize it by marching on Rome, he roared to a crowd of 40,000 in Naples. Thousands of Blackshirts began to mobilize, shivering in the autumn rain, armed with rusted rifles, pitchforks, and a fanatical belief in their leader. They moved toward the capital in 3 columns, a ragged army of 30,000 men. But where was the Duce? While his men were huddled in the mud of the outskirts, Mussolini was 400 miles away in Milan. He wasn't on the front lines. He was hiding in the editorial offices of his newspaper, his eyes darting to the telephone. He was the paper tiger, playing the ultimate game of high-stakes poker. In his pocket, he kept a train ticket to Switzerland. He had calculated the odds. If the army opened fire, he would be over the border before the first body hit the cobblestones. He didn't want to be a martyr. He wanted to be a monarch. The only thing standing between Mussolini and total power was a man who barely stood 5 feet tall, King Victor Emmanuel III. The Prime Minister, Luigi Facta, finally grew a spine and brought the king a decree for martial law. The Italian army was professional, well-armed, and loyal. They could have swept the ragtag Blackshirts into the Tiber with a single whiff of grape shot. The generals waited for the order. But the king hesitated. He looked out his window and saw the ghosts of a civil war. He feared his cousin, the Duke of Aosta, might side with the fascists and take his crown. He feared the streets would run red with Italian blood shed by Italian hands. In a moment of historic cowardice, the king refused to sign. He tore up the decree, effectively handing the keys of the kingdom to a man who had spent his life mocking the monarchy. The bluff had worked. The state had folded without firing a single shot. On October 30th, Mussolini finally boarded a train. He didn't arrive on a white horse amidst the dust of a conquered city. He arrived in a Pullman sleeping car, comfortably tucked into a first-class berth. When he stepped onto the platform in Rome, he was a master of optics. He hurried to the Quirinale Palace to meet the king. He hadn't changed into a formal morning suit. He wore his mud-splattered black shirt, the uniform of the street brawler. He bowed to the king and uttered the greatest lie of the century. "Your Majesty, I come from the battlefields." It was pure theater. There had been no battle, only a parade. But the king was charmed, or perhaps relieved. He invited the son of a blacksmith to form a government. In that moment, the liberal state, the dream of Garibaldi and Cavour, breathed its last. Mussolini was now prime minister, but he was not yet a dictator. He was the head of a coalition, a wolf in a room full of sheep who thought they could tame him. He moved with the calculated patience of a predator. He knew that to kill democracy, you don't always need a coup. Sometimes you just need a pen. He introduced the Acerbo law. It was a masterstroke of political rigging. Any party that gained 25% of the vote would automatically receive 2/3 of the seats in parliament. It was the legal revolution. He didn't burn the parliament building. He simply filled it with his own echoes. Opposition voices were silenced, sometimes by the vote, often by the club. The most vocal critic, Giacomo Matteotti, was kidnapped and murdered in broad daylight. The mask of the statesman slipped, revealing the face of the thug. But it was too late. The middle class, terrified of the alternative, looked away. Mussolini began to systematically dismantle the institutions of the state. He banned trade unions. He censored the press. He replaced local mayors with podestà appointed by Rome. He was no longer a man. He was Il Duce, an infallible entity that absorbed the identity of every Italian citizen. The individual was no longer the building block of society. The state was the only reality. Mussolini stood before a cowed parliament and delivered the final eulogy for the old world. Everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. We have stepped over the decaying corpse of liberty, and if necessary, we will step over it again. The era of the individual was dead. The era of the machine had begun. The Hall of Mirrors. By 1925, the man known as Benito Mussolini had ceased to be a mere human being of flesh and bone. He had become an atmosphere. He was the air the Italians breathed, the ink in their children's primers, and the looming shadow on every tenement wall. He had moved his headquarters to the Palazzo Venezia in the heart of Rome. From his massive desk at the end of a 60-foot hall, he orchestrated the greatest marketing campaign in human history. This was the birth of the cult of the Duce. The slogan was painted in block letters across the whitewashed walls of rural villages and the grand boulevards of Milan. Mussolini ha sempre ragione. Mussolini is always right. He was the first truly cinematic dictator. He understood that in the age of the newsreel, a leader's profile was more important than his policy. He spent hours practicing his poses in front of mirrors, the chin thrust forward to suggest granite strength, the eyes bugged out to project a superhuman intensity, the hands on hips to evoke the stance of a conqueror. Mussolini's Italy was a giant stage, and he was the only actor who received a script. To the world, he presented a vision of hyper-masculinity that bordered on the absurd. The cameras were always there, clicking away as he performed his stunts. One day, he was the first peasant of Italy, stripping off his shirt in the sweltering July heat to harvest wheat alongside the farmers of the Agropontino. The images were distributed globally, the bare-chested leader, glistening with sweat, pitchfork in hand, a man of the people. The next day, he was the modern Caesar, goggles strapped to his helmet as he pushed an Alfa Romeo to its breaking point or piloted a seaplane over the Mediterranean. He wrestled lion cubs in his private zoo. He fenced with Olympic masters. He wanted the world to see a body that never tired, a mind that never slept, and a soul that felt no fear. He wasn't just a prime minister, he was a Roman god in a modern suit, a bridge between the ancient world and the high-speed future of futurism. But a temple needs a temple. Mussolini looked at the winding, chaotic, medieval streets of Rome and saw a mess that needed to be scrubbed clean. He dreamed of the third Rome. The first Rome was that of the emperors, the second Rome was that of the popes, the third Rome would be his, a city of cold marble, straight lines, and terrifying scale. He ordered the demolition of entire historic neighborhoods, displacing thousands of the very people he claimed to love just to uncover the ruins of Augustus and Caesar. He wanted the modern Italian to walk past the Colosseum and see not a ruin, but a mirror. This vision culminated in the EUR district, a planned city of white travertine. At its heart sat the Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana, often called the Square Colosseum. It was a haunting, minimalist cube of arches, sleek, cold, and stripped of all human warmth. It was architecture as a weapon, designed to make the individual feel like a grain of sand against the monumental weight of the state.
The facade of the orderly state was nearly shattered in June 1924. Giacomo Matteotti, a courageous socialist deputy, stood up in Parliament and laid out the truth. The recent elections had been a sham, a festival of fraud and black-shirt intimidation. 11 days later, Matteotti vanished. He had been bundled into a car in broad daylight, stabbed to death with a carpenter's file, and buried in a shallow grave outside Rome. The public outcry was a tidal wave. For a few weeks, Mussolini's bravado vanished. He stayed in his office, lights off, trembling. The king wavered. The press began to growl. It was the moment the grand bluff was almost called. But the opposition was fractured and weak. Sensing their hesitation, Mussolini stopped hiding. On January 3, 1925, he strode into the Chamber of Deputies and delivered the speech that ended Italian democracy forever. He didn't deny the murder. He didn't apologize. He leaned into the microphone and roared, "I declare before this chamber, before the whole Italian people, that I and I alone assume the political, moral, and historical responsibility for everything that has happened. If fascism has been a criminal association, I am the head of that association." It was a dare. If I am a murderer, he was saying, then come and take me. No one moved. The dictatorship was no longer a secret, it was the law. With the opposition crushed, Mussolini leaned into the great myth of fascist utility. Every tourist and foreign journalist returning from Italy carried the same tired refrain, "At least he made the trains run on time." It was the ultimate propaganda victory, and it was largely a lie. The improvements to the Italian rail system were the result of investments made by the liberal governments before 1922. The punctuality was often an illusion created by punishing any station master who reported a delay and censoring any news of accidents. But the myth mattered more than the reality. It gave the middle class a reason to surrender their freedom. They traded their right to speak and their right to vote for the promise of a quiet life and a reliable commute. They accepted the ink of the state-controlled newspapers, which filtered out every failure and magnified every miracle. Italy had become a country of quiet order, where the only noise allowed was the roar of the crowd in the Piazza Venezia. By 1934, Mussolini had reached his zenith. He had conquered the unions, the parliament, and the very psyche of the Italian people. He had turned the nation into a museum of his own ego. But the square Colosseum and the grain harvests were no longer enough to satisfy the blacksmith's son. He looked out from his balcony toward the south, across the Italian lake of the Mediterranean. His eyes landed on the maps of Africa, specifically the ancient highlands of Ethiopia. He had convinced the Italians they were the heirs to the Caesars. Now he had to give them an empire to prove it. He had conquered Italy's mind. Now he wanted to redraw the world's map in Roman red.
By 1935, the Duce was bored. Domestic triumphs, the draining of marshes, the building of marble cities, the silencing of dissent had become routine. He was a man who lived for the adrenaline of the struggle, and Italy was too quiet. He needed the smoke of cannons to feel alive. He turned his eyes toward the Horn of Africa, specifically Ethiopia, the last uncolonized jewel on the continent. It was a chance to avenge a 19th-century defeat and finally grant Italy its place in the sun. But as Mussolini reached for the stars of empire, he tripped into a shadow that would eventually consume him, the rising power of the Third Reich. This is the chapter of the fatal friendship, the moment the teacher of fascism became the puppet of Nazism. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 was framed by the fascist propaganda machine as a civilizing mission, a crusade to bring Roman law and modern medicine to a barbaric land. Mussolini stood on his balcony, declaring that Italy finally had its empire. The reality was far darker. Faced with a spirited Ethiopian resistance that refused to break under traditional mountain warfare, Mussolini authorized the unthinkable. He ordered the use of mustard gas. From the bellies of Italian aircraft fell a rain of chemical death. It wasn't civilization being delivered, it was agony. The gas burned the lungs and blinded the eyes of Ethiopian soldiers who fought with 19th-century rifles against 20th-century chemistry. The League of Nations cried foul, imposing economic sanctions. Mussolini, defiant and ego-bloated, laughed at them. He used the sanctions to fuel a Buy Italian frenzy. But the isolation was real. He had burned his bridges with London and Paris. He had nowhere left to turn but north. In 1934, when Mussolini first met Adolf Hitler in Venice, the power dynamic was clear. Mussolini was the established titan, the elder statesman of autocracy. Hitler was the fanatical upstart, a man who had literally kept a bust of Mussolini in his Brown House headquarters. Mussolini was unimpressed. He watched the Austrian corporal twitch and ramble in a cheap raincoat. He later whispered to his aides that Hitler was a silly little monkey and a plumber in a Macintosh. He mocked Hitler's racial theories, his scientific nonsense, pointing out that Italy had been a civilization while the Germans were still illiterate tribes in the forest. But the irony of history is a cruel blade. As the 1930s progressed, Germany's industrial and military machines surged with terrifying speed, while Italy's remained a hollow shell of rhetoric and recycled scrap metal. The plumber was building a juggernaut. The Caesar was building a stage set. The turning point came in 1937, during Mussolini's state visit to Germany. Hitler, a master of psychological manipulation, gave the Duce the grand tour. He showed Mussolini hundreds of thousands of goose-stepping soldiers, forests of swastika banners, and the roaring factories of the Ruhr. He staged massive rallies, with a choreographed precision put the Italian Blackshirts to shame.
Mussolini, a man who lived for spectacle, was intoxicated. He returned to Rome not as a mentor, but an admirer. He was blinded by the sleek, cold efficiency of German power. The result was the Axis of Steel. To prove his loyalty to this new order, Mussolini committed his greatest domestic betrayal. In 1938, he introduced the Manifesto of Race. For years, Mussolini had ignored or even mocked anti-Semitism. He had Jewish members in the Fascist Party and a long-term Jewish mistress, Margherita Sarfatti. But to align with Hitler, he turned on his own citizens. He stripped Italian Jews of their jobs, their schools, and their dignity. It was a pivot born not of conviction, but of a desperate, pathetic need to look tough in the eyes of his German partner. The Duce was no longer leading Italy, he was following Berlin.
September 1939. Hitler invaded Poland. The world caught fire. Mussolini panicked. He knew, and his generals warned him, that Italy was utterly unprepared for a modern industrial war. Their tanks were sardine tins, their rifles were antiquated, and their coal reserves were non-existent. The military told him Italy wouldn't be ready until 1943 at the earliest. But Mussolini watched from the sidelines as the Wehrmacht tore through France in 1940. He saw the Master of Europe title slipping away from him. He couldn't bear the thought of Hitler winning the war while he sat in Rome like a retired clerk. On June 10, 1940, he stepped onto the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia. The crowd roared, but the air felt heavy with dread. Mussolini declared war on Britain and France. When his chief of staff, Marshal Badoglio, warned him that it was suicide, Mussolini replied with the chilling coldness of a man who viewed human life as a mere statistic for the history books. "I only need a few thousand dead so that I can sit at the peace conference as a man who has fought." He believed the war was already over, that he was simply vulturing a victory Hitler had already won. It was the ultimate miscalculation. The reality check was instantaneous and brutal. Mussolini tried to launch his own blitzkrieg in North Africa and Greece, hoping to show Hitler that Italy was a martial power. Instead, the world saw the paper tiger tear. In the deserts of Egypt and Libya, the Italian army, poorly led, under-equipped, and uninspired, was routed by British forces. In the mountains of Greece, Mussolini's legions were pushed back by a much smaller Greek army. The new Roman Empire wasn't a marble monument, it was a house of cards. Mussolini had spent 20 years building a cult of personality, but he had forgotten to build a military. As the first Italian soldiers began to surrender in the thousands in the African dust, the wind began to blow through the arches of the Third Rome. The Duce was still standing on his balcony, but for the first time, he was looking over his shoulder.
By July 1943, the new Roman Empire was no longer a dream, it was a smoking ruin. The Allies had leapt from North Africa to the shores of Sicily. For the first time in centuries, the sacred soil of Italy was under foreign tread. In Rome, the sky didn't rain Roman glory, it rained Allied bombs. The sirens wailed a constant, piercing eulogy for the fascist experiment. Mussolini was a ghost of his former self. Plagued by stomach ulcers and a crumbling spirit, he spent his days staring at maps of fronts that no longer existed. He didn't realize that the greatest threat wasn't the American 7th Army, it was the men sitting across from him in the Palazzo Venezia. On the night of July 24, 1943, the Grand Council of Fascism met for the first time in years. They didn't mean to praise the Duce, they meant to bury him. The air in the room was thick with tobacco smoke and betrayal. Mussolini sat at the head of the table, expecting his old subordinates to cower as they always had. Instead,
Dino Grandi, a man Mussolini had elevated to power, stood up and challenged him. The most stinging blow, however, came from Count Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's own son-in-law. When Ciano raised his hand to vote for the Duce's removal, Mussolini's jaw dropped. It wasn't just a political defeat, it was a familial execution. The next afternoon, Mussolini went to see King Victor Emmanuel III, expecting the monarch to dismiss the council's vote. He thought he was still the protagonist. He was wrong. The king, finally finding a spine in the wreckage of his kingdom, told Mussolini the war was lost and his services were no longer required. As Mussolini stepped out of the palace, he wasn't met by his honor guard, he was met by carabinieri who ushered him into a Red Cross ambulance. The man who had spent 20 years cultivated the image of a titan was shoved into the back of a medical van like a common criminal or a patient too sick to be saved. The grand bluff ended in a whimper. Mussolini was spirited away, moved from one secret location to another until he was finally imprisoned at the Campo Imperatore Hotel. It was a desolate resort perched 7,000 feet up in the Gran Sasso d'Italia, accessible only by cable car. This was Mussolini's St. Helena. He spent his days pacing the small, drafty rooms, staring out at the jagged peaks of the Apennines. He was suicidal, convinced that the Italians had moved on and that history had closed its books on him. The thin, freezing mountain air seemed to mock him. The man who ruled from a balcony was now trapped in a cage of clouds. He was a relic, a piece of forgotten luggage left in the sky. But if the Italians had forgotten Mussolini, Adolf Hitler had not. Hitler didn't rescue Mussolini out of friendship. He rescued him because a dead or captured Duce was a liability to the German front in Italy. On September 12, 1943, the silence of the Gran Sasso was shattered by the whistling of German gliders. In an incredible feat of daring, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, the most dangerous man in Europe, led a team of paratroopers onto the tiny rock-strewn ledge.
Mussolini had no choice. He became the puppet king of the Republic of Salo, a pathetic strip of northern Italy, headquartered on the shores of Lake Garda. The Salo Republic was a nightmare. It was a ghost state where Mussolini had no real power. The Germans controlled the phones, the mail, and the military. It was a period of horrific Black Brigade violence, where the last die-hard fascists hunted down partisans and Jews with a desperate end-of-the-world cruelty. Mussolini, once the arbiter of Italian life, now spent his days signing death warrants for the very men who had betrayed him at the Grand Council, including his own son-in-law, Ciano. He watched from his window as his daughter, Etta, fled into Switzerland, cursing her father's name as Ciano was tied to a chair and shot in the back. In these final months, the atmosphere around Mussolini was one of damp, gray decay. The cold wind of Lake Garda rattled the windows of his villa, a constant reminder of his isolation. He was no longer a leader, he was a hostage of the Wehrmacht. He had one final meeting with his wife, Rachele. He looked at her with eyes that had seen the fire go out. He no longer spoke of the Third Rome or new empires. He spoke of the end. He told her, "I am a corpse, and my only desire is to be buried." He realized that he was the architect of his own prison. He had created a system based on the worship of a man, and now that the man was broken, the system was eating itself alive. He was the living dead, presiding over a kingdom of shadows, waiting for the inevitable sound of Allied tanks to drown out the echoes of his own propaganda. The Allied forces were breaking through the Gothic line. The partisans were rising in the mountains. The map of Italy was shrinking daily, closing in on the small lakeside villa. Mussolini's time on the stage was over. The lights were fading, and the only thing left was the final act, the escape and the meat hook. The rescue was high-octane Hollywood. The Germans burst into the hotel, guns drawn, ready for a massacre. But they found a broken man. When Skorzeny burst into the room and shouted, "Duce, the Führer has sent me to set you free," Mussolini didn't look like a conqueror, he looked hollowed out, his suit hanging off his shrunken frame. The contrast was devastating. The Germans were the new masters of the new order, vibrant and lethal, while Mussolini was a waxwork figure, melting in the sun. Mussolini was flown to Germany, where Hitler laid out the cold, hard truth. Mussolini would return to Italy to head a new social republic, or Hitler would treat Italy as an occupied enemy territory and level Milan, Turin, and Genoa.
By April 1945, the grand theater of fascism had been reduced to a single sputtering candle. The Allied armies were pouring into the Po Valley, and the German war machine was fracturing like dry glass. In his final days in Milan, Mussolini was a man of frantic, jagged movements. He spoke of a last stand in the Alps, of a redoubt where the faithful would die in a blaze of Wagnerian glory. But there was no glory left. There was only the road. On April 27th, a small convoy of German trucks rumbled toward the Swiss border. Tucked in the back of one vehicle, amidst a group of retreating soldiers, sat a man wrapped in a heavy German corporal's overcoat. He wore a steel helmet pulled low, his face turned toward the floorboards. He was trying to disappear into the gray fabric of the army he had once hoped to lead. But you cannot hide a face that has been plastered on every wall in Italy for 20 years. The convoy was halted at a partisan checkpoint near the village of Dongo, on the shores of Lake Como. A partisan named Giuseppe Negri climbed into the back of the truck, scanning the weary faces of the Germans. He stopped at a man slumped in the corner, feigning sleep, a bottle of wine at his feet. Even through the shadow of the helmet and the collar of the coat, the anatomy of an era was visible. Negri saw the heavy, unmistakable jawline, the granite chin that had jutted over the Piazza Venezia. He saw the wide, scorched eyes of the man of the crowd. "We have the big head," the shout went up. The god of Italy was pulled from the truck like a stray dog. There was no resistance, no defiant speech, no poison pill. Mussolini was led into a local town hall, a shivering shell of a man who seemed more relieved to be caught than terrified to die. The masquerade was over. Mussolini was moved to a small, secluded farmhouse in the hills, accompanied by his mistress, Claretta Petacci, who had refused to leave his side. This was the final night of the new Caesar. There were no marble halls, no tapestries, and no cheering thousands. There was only the rhythmic thrum of rain against a wooden roof and the smell of damp earth. He and Claretta spent their final hours in a modest bedroom, guarded by men who had spent years dreaming of this moment. Mussolini spent the night in a state of strange, detached calm. He had lived his life as a performance, and perhaps he knew that the final act required a certain stoicism. He didn't ask for mercy. He knew the economy of violence better than anyone. He had spent decades trading in it, and he knew his debt was finally due. As the gray dawn broke over Lake Como, he looked out at the water, the same Italian lake he had promised to conquer, and waited for the sound of boots on the stairs.
On the afternoon of April 28th, Mussolini and Petacci were driven to a quiet spot in front of the gates of Villa Belmonte. The man tasked with the execution, Walter Audicio, ordered them to stand against the wall. Claretta threw her arms around Mussolini, screaming, "He must not die." The staccato of the machine gun shattered the silence of the afternoon. A few bursts of fire, a few puffs of dust from the stone wall, and the Duce collapsed into the grass. The man who had once claimed that blood alone moves the wheels of history had finally contributed his own. The silence that followed was absolute. The sound of 20 years of noise, ego, and propaganda suddenly exhaling its last breath. The bodies were loaded into a van and driven through the night to Milan, arriving at the Piazzale Loreto. The location was chosen for its poetic, if brutal, justice. It was the site where, months earlier, the fascists had executed 15 partisans and left their bodies on display. By morning, the word had spread. A mob gathered, a sea of people who, only years before, might have wept at the sight of his car passing by. Now they were a creature of pure,
unadulterated rage. They kicked the corpses, spat on the faces, and even fired shots into the lifeless remains. It was mob justice in its most primal form, the violent reclamation of a people who felt they had been swindled by a dream. To save the bodies from being torn to pieces, the partisans hoisted them up. They used meat hooks from a nearby Standard Oil gas station, hanging Mussolini, Claretta, and several fascist leaders upside down from the steel girders. The image is the most haunting in Italian history, the Titan hanging like a carcass in a butcher shop. The upside-down perspective was the final irony. For 20 years, Mussolini had looked down on Italy from his balcony. Now, Italy looked down on him. The world was right side up again, and the man who had tried to flip history was hanging by his heels in the dirt. Unlike Adolf Hitler, who vanished into the ash and shadow of a Berlin bunker, Mussolini's end was terrifyingly public. Today, his body lies in a crypt in his hometown of Prodapio. It remains a site of chilling duality, a place of pilgrimage for the unrepentant few who still long for the order of the club, and a site of profound shame for a nation that still grapples with the scars he left behind. Mussolini once said he wanted to make Italy great. In the end, he only succeeded in making it a graveyard. He was a man who lived by the image, and in the end, that image was torn to pieces by the very hands that once clapped for him. He forgot the most fundamental rule of the piazza. The same crowd that carries you on their shoulders can just as easily trample you into the mud. He sought to own the soul of a people, but souls cannot be owned, only borrowed, until the debt of reality comes to collect.